What started last week with 6 people who have all gone missing or died under mysterious circumstances over the past several months has now grown to at least 8 people and counting. Last week we discussed Monica Jacinto Reza, an aerospace engineer, co-inventor of Mondaloy, a mysterious covert government material used in advanced spacecraft, which was heavily funded by the United States Air Force. And then on June 22nd of 2025, she goes hiking in the Angeles National Forest, waves at her friend about 30 feet in front of her, and then 10 minutes later was noticed that she had completely vanished. No signs of her were ever found. On October the 25th of 2025, we have a man named Jacob Pritchard involved in the Censors Directorate for the Air Force with a top secret security clearance. He supposedly takes the life of his wife, Jamie, although we contested that very clearly in the last episode. And then he goes on to take the life of another co-worker, who from all accounts he either didn't know very well or had literally only ever seen in passing. And then after taking the life of his wife and this other individual who he also worked with, he drives the body of his wife in the trunk of his car to a nearby municipal building, opens the trunk in front of a camera, and then takes his own life. And that insane story given to us by the media and the government is all the evidence we have. None of this has ever been proven to the public to be true. After this, we've also got Carl Grillmair. He's a Caltech astronomer, among many things, but he's really and truly a super highly regarded scientist involved in the detection of deep space objects, among countless other things. He has a resume longer than my arm of some of the most impressive things a scientist can be involved in today. His public work like asteroid detection, however, could also easily be used and has been used by Defense Department contractors and other adjacent government organizations, and even the government itself, for the detection of military weapons and satellites, along with a bunch of other things. In addition to that, it's likely he did some private work that will probably never be known about that also may have put him onto a list, because in December of 2025, an armed man is caught walking on his property by Carl, and then Carl, who lives out in the middle of nowhere because he wanted to build his own observatory to view the stars, calls the police, and fortunately they get there in time to stop the threat. The man's name we find out is Freddie Schneider, that was on Carl's property. He would get arrested for this felony arms charge, and then he would also get sentenced once again on top of the arms charge for trying to escape prison, and the judge, for some unknown reason due to an obscure California penal code, decided to drop all charges. And then on February 16th of 2026, this same man would return just a couple months later to Carl's property and would blast him on his front porch. By the time the police arrived, he was dead on the scene. And then obviously we've also got General William Neil McCasland, who just completely disappeared, and he was the guy behind the funding of at least Monica Reza's work in developing this covert space material, and also possibly involved in the work of other people on this list, including running the base that these 3 people worked at, who were all found dead on the same night. And the base these 3 worked at is known to be involved in deep covert operations for the government and weapons tech development and other black budget programs like that, as well as a variety of other top secret, let's not talk about this sort of things, which is why they all had very high level security clearances. And then obviously this list does continue to today. With these people listed, you would think it would stop there, but the list does grow. All of these names in mind, and I recommend watching the first episode if you're a little confused what I'm talking about. There's a new person we have to discuss on this list, a new scientist whose missing cases now beginning to be looked at with a second pair of eyes and a new mindset, as we find out that she too also worked in this covert government Department of Defense top level research, but this time it was in New Mexico at Los Alamos National Laboratories, a place with a multi-billion-dollar budget that has been involved in covert projects from the Manhattan Project all the way up to today in developing the most advanced aircraft and most advanced weapon systems known to man. And right there is where we jump in with Melissa Casillas. She is a wife, a mother, and she has a story that will send shivers down your spine, especially considering that Melissa disappeared just a couple hours from where our friend Neil McCasland, who funded all of this work, also disappeared from. Melissa was a long-time administrative assistant at Los Alamos National Laboratory for an unknown official at that lab. Presumably, though, this person is of a high rank, as they have an administrative assistant and were also the one that made the call that Melissa hadn't shown up for work to her husband, who then went on a search for her, only to find out that something very strange had happened. Worth noting, though, that her husband is noted as being a Superintendent 3 at Los Alamos Labs, which is a higher ranking position. What exactly his job entails, though, is a complete unknown. It does seem to also require quite a security clearance, though, so take that as you may. Melissa's case is arguably stranger than the others because we have a little bit more information due to her family and some people nearby about what might have happened. She, in a very weird way, was spotted by multiple people, but what they saw only makes the situation more confusing. So let's start from the beginning of what happened with her. According to Mark, Melissa's husband, they carpooled together to work at Los Alamos Labs, where they got through the checkpoint, and then Melissa, as they did every day, dropped Mark off at his section of the office, and she drove to where she works. What was unknown at that time, however, is that although Melissa had told her husband she was driving to where she always does, she actually left the campus and headed home, arriving around 7:45 a.m., which was noted by her daughter as strange because they're normally at work well before that. And so when she got back, her daughter Sierra asked Melissa, "What are you doing here?" And her mother responded quickly by stating that she had forgotten her badge. Now at the time, Sierra had just gotten out of bed, likely wasn't thinking too much into it, but she realized later, and so did her husband Mark, that this was obviously untrue because the person driving the car into Los Alamos National Laboratory always has to show ID badges to get in. And so Melissa obviously couldn't have gotten in to drop off her husband had she not had her ID on her. So that was just a complete lie that she told her daughter. So why she told that lie is really what's in question right now. A short while later, Melissa told her daughter Sierra that she had decided to either, quote, work from home or call out for the day because it was a long drive back to the office and she'd already wasted so much time at this point. And so at that point, Sierra notes that there was nothing unusual going on, her behavior wasn't different, and since she didn't pick up the story about the ID, there was nothing that caught her off guard. And then shortly after this interaction, Sierra left to go to work. And it would be around 12:30 p.m. when Melissa would pick up a Subway sandwich for her daughter and then drop it off at Sierra's workplace, and then that would be the last time the two spoke ever again. As from then on, the whereabouts and the actions of Melissa make almost zero sense whatsoever. In the roughly 7-minute conversation the two had didn't reveal much information, and in fact, the most that we get from it is that Sierra had asked her mom to drop off a check for her at the bank and Melissa had agreed to do so. They then said they love you, and they parted ways. While this is all going on, Mark, her husband, is at the office and realizes he needs the car for something, and it's now 11 o'clock and Melissa hasn't returned and he can't get in contact with her, so he's getting a little confused and worried, but chalks it up to the chance that maybe Melissa had just gotten busy at work and wasn't looking at her phone and didn't realize what time it was. And that was the case until he got a call from Melissa's boss that afternoon asking if Melissa was okay, and then he said, yeah, shouldn't she be at work? And that's when she told me she hadn't shown up to work. At which moment Mark knew something was deeply wrong. Sierra, that being Melissa's daughter, says that she got a text from her father around 1:30 p.m. and was asking if she had seen or made contact with her mother. And she said yeah, she had just seen her an hour before that. And so Sierra told her mom to get in contact with her dad because he was starting to freak out and get really worried. And so Sierra screenshotted the text from her dad, sent it to her mom, and then left it be because she had seen that her mom, remember this, had read the message from her end. And then like we said, she just let it be, assuming they would deal with it themselves. But they obviously didn't because Mark would never hear from her. In fact, it would be only 45 minutes later that the last known confirmed sighting of Melissa was ever made, about 3 miles from their house, where she was captured on a security video from a local business. She was observed walking eastbound on New Mexico 518, wearing the clothing she was last reported wearing in the Taos Plaza, that being a light colored shirt, jeans, and light tennis shoes. The camera doesn't offer much, but it seems like she was okay at that time. It doesn't appear that there was anything too strange going on, at least not by her facial expressions. Here's where things get really, really strange. It is also believed that there's another person who spotted Melissa, this being a neighbor or an acquaintance they're described as. They report seeing Melissa along the road and catching some video of her. And they also state that they had seen a car following her. And so this neighbor had gone out and tried to talk to Melissa or had just driven by Melissa. The account is a little hard to wrap your mind around, and said, all right, she seems fine. And so they drove past, drove back, still saw Melissa on the road, and then went home. And it wasn't until 10 or 15 minutes later that they once again couldn't shake this idea of being concerned about her. And so they drove back down the same road to see what was going on with her. And all they found was nothing. Melissa had completely disappeared, and all they could see was a blue pickup truck speeding off into the distance, and Melissa was nowhere to be found. This account, however, seems to be completely ignored by the police, and they say that there is nothing suspicious about that, and or that they are supposedly investigating it. Mark and Sierra, though, obviously have no idea about this, and so it's around 2 p.m. when in the middle of a rush at work, Sierra begins getting a bunch of calls from her father, and so she couldn't get to the phone for about 20 minutes, and by the time she did around 2:30, they were just frantic voicemails, and he sounded very worried. And then at that point, it becomes clear that no one had heard from Melissa for several hours. At which point Sierra texts her mom's phone once more saying, hey, dad's getting really worried about you. You need to get in contact with him. But the text bounces saying it was never delivered. At this point, Sierra leaves work, goes home around 3:30, and the door is locked. Remember that? The car is at home, and the first thing Sierra sees on the inside is that the keys and her work phone were on the kitchen table. And then she went to search the house really quick, and while looking around, Sierra remembers her mom's office, goes in, and that's where she finds her other phone, her purse, her wallet. Basically everything that relates to her personally was on this table and strewn around the office. Sierra at this point is obviously very concerned, and so she clicks on the phone and sees that it had been factory reset. It had been completely wiped. She goes and checks the other phone, and the exact same thing had happened to that one. They'd both been factory reset, all of their data deleted. Sierra also finds a check that she had given her mom sitting in the office. Everything that could be confirmed as belonging to Melissa, except for the clothes on her back, were in that office or in the house in general. Mark and Sierra are obviously freaking at this point, but that's really where our mystery is going to begin for us. Because despite search efforts, despite tracing the roads, literally nothing was ever found, especially not by the police, who seem to be slow rolling this investigation like crazy. And here's an example. That blue pickup truck we saw speeding off into the distance around about the same area where Melissa was seen by that acquaintance, there would be a pile of clothes later found in this same exact vicinity of where this vehicle was seen speeding away, and the pile of clothes upon further inspection was a pair of jeans and a t-shirt. The exact same things that Melissa was reported as last wearing. However, what the dead giveaway was that there was a hair tie tied to the back of the jeans to cinch it up, which Melissa had begun doing as she had started taking a thyroid medication that resulted in a huge drop in weight. And yet the police decided to say that this was not Melissa's clothing and that it didn't match what she was last seen in, despite literally matching what she was last seen in. So the police then also not only refused to investigate this further, they didn't even send it in for lab testing and just threw it into storage and into the evidence room where it's just going to sit and rot. This is just one strange example of a lack of police work here, but that's honestly become endemic of all of these cases where you'll have them end searches early, not apply a ton of effort, and basically forget these people existed within a few days of it happening. With one case, Monica Reza, her search team only lasted 8 days, which is 6 days below the minimum that these things typically go for. And so considering Melissa is heavily tied to the defense industry, one has to begin wondering what exactly she knew and was involved in, why she didn't go into work that day, who her boss is, and why she disappeared, and possibly most importantly, who factory reset those phones, whose clothes were those actually on the side of the road, and who was driving away that blue truck. Because we know someone else had to have been involved in this because of one detail the police probably shouldn't have given us, but thankfully Sierra did tell us this in one of her interviews. Sierra tells us that the doors to the house were locked, and yet Monica's keys were on the kitchen table, and there were no spare keys missing. And her husband was obviously at work, like an hour away, and Sierra was also at work. So who then had the keys to lock the door, and who took Melissa or coerced her into leaving? Because something is very clearly strange about how she disappeared from her home, almost exactly like Neil McCasland and Monica Reza, vanishing into the wilderness, with no trace of them ever found. But it does all get worse than this. Now that we've gone through the intro to this case, as it is possibly the most mysterious of all of them, in terms of how someone could disappear like this in an area with tons of cameras and the police refuse to investigate obvious leads, the case gets even stranger because when you begin researching it, you're going to notice that there's a very large lack. As we investigate these cases, it is worth thanking the Sentinel for their great work. They've been doing a stand-up job staying on top of this case and the developments that are occurring, and their work is invaluable, so make sure to check out their Substack. It's popping over there. That said, let's continue. Doing further research, I learned that Melissa's case is beyond words obvious that something is wrong. Firstly, in the home, the police are later reported as having found a set of boots that her husband said hadn't been worn in a long time and had garnered cobwebs, and so the police then pull them out and show him that they had been used, and not only that, there were no cobwebs, but there was mud stuck to them, which was clearly a surprise. Even more surprised that they found some splotches of blood supposedly inside of the bedroom, although no more details than this have been given. And in order to get that odd little detail, you really have to dig, because mainstream media just isn't reporting it. Continually in the home is found, as we mentioned, Melissa's keys to the house, which then I have to ask, if Melissa was the only one home, her husband was at work, her daughter was at work, and her keys are inside the house, how then did the doors to the house get locked like Sierra tells us they were when she got home? Which is something that the police have never addressed. And beyond the fact that we know from reports there were no sets of spare keys missing, meaning they were all accounted for, we have the 2 phones sitting next to the keys that were factory reset. Come on. Foul play should have been the first thing on everyone's mind. And yet, it would appear that the disappearance and she did it on her own volition is the most popular narrative that's being spread. Interestingly, like spreading the lie that Neil McCasland was slowly losing his brain function to dementia, which I might add is a complete lie that the wife has refuted. I think it's worth adding that it's also been reported that Melissa was in some financial troubles, but there's very little to zero evidence of that. In fact, the only thing that we have for reports on that matter is that there was a $600 overdraft on her account. $600, I'm going to say, is not an amount of money that you disappear yourself over, especially considering that her husband made 2 to 3 times as much as she does, and they just use her salary for paying bills. So I don't really think this is a case of she did this because she was in some huge debt. That just doesn't make sense, but it has been reported that way by a number of sources. While on that note, I want to add something else. For some reason, the husband Mark and Sierra, the daughter, have been pushing pretty hard at the she disappeared herself angle and ignore pretty unscrupulously all of the other available evidence of something being wrong. At least that's how it has been framed in the media. If I'm wrong and they want to reach out, I would love to hear their side of this story. But from how I'm reading it, it's honestly a little weird to me and convenient that things like the doors, the phones, and the truck following Melissa are never addressed, or if they are, it's with very little effort, and they make us seem dumb for wondering. Like, yeah, I think we should investigate the blue truck that's spotted following Melissa and then speeding off into the distance from the last person to have seen her. And so I don't want to point fingers, but Melissa is only one of 2 people in that family who worked at one of America's most well-guarded and top-secret laboratories. So her husband was and is still employed by Los Alamos Laboratories. And like I said, the details are a little hairy, but it seems like this neighbor that spotted Melissa and went out to see if she was all right, we should be talking to him more, and his story should definitely be pushed more. And I hate to say it, but it's true. Money has a huge push, especially in this culture, and Los Alamos Labs spend something like $2 billion a year on just salaries in New Mexico, and another $752 million into the community every year. So that sort of money does bring you a lot of influence, especially in police departments, which I'm going to suggest could possibly be receiving donations and extra security work from the labs. But like I said, it's just speculation. So corruption like that is not uncommon whatsoever. But what's most peculiar to me is how eerily this case matches that of Neil McCasland and Monica Reza. All 3 of these people went missing into desert-esque regions of New Mexico and California, places they had all been to frequently. All of them have connections to defense industries and aerospace and top-secret government research. Each disappears without a trace, and to this day, not a single sighting is made of any of them. That all top of mind, there is another piece of evidence that I want to add to this connection that's really going to bring this all to the forefront. And it's a strikingly strange Twitter account we know of because of the work of the Sentinel. And it's named Electric Propulsive Spacecraft Systems. The profile picture and banner each feature 2, and this is the grammatically correct way of putting it, old-timey sciencey looking guys on the front, and the bio reads as follows: Electric Propulsive Spacecraft Systems. Electric Propulsive Spacecraft and Spacecraft Systems Manufacturing. Experience: retired 38-year active duty U.S. Air Force PhD engineer, AFIT/AETC/AFMC UTOU, those being the colleges he went to. Off the bat, this should sound eerily familiar, especially if you watch the previous episode on this same topic, because that's wildly similar to the credentials of Neil McCasland, the most famous and powerful of people who have gone missing or been dealt with thus far. That would be the general who funded all of these covert projects. And so what's eerie is that Neil fits almost all of these categories. It's just swapped things like the school and his areas of expertise. And what stands out about this account in the bio is that if you didn't know that it was Neil, you wouldn't pick it up because these are not his exact credentials. But if you know it's Neil, you start to notice some similarities. And it's something that you might do if you were trying to cover up your traces, yet still promote the idea that you are experienced. And so the difference between Neil's actual work history and life history and the bio of this account actually tell us more possibly than anything else. Because Neil spent most of his life on the fence. He seems like he did not want to be known as an aliens guy publicly, but behind the scenes was working to some extent on disclosure. And we know this is true because in the leaked Clinton emails from 2016, there are multiple times he has brought up on this exact topic. And here are a few examples. The subject is General McCasland, and it reads, he mentioned he's a quote skeptic. He's not. I've been working with him for 4 months. I just got done giving him a 4-hour presentation on the entire project a few weeks ago. Trust me, the advice has already been happening on how to do all this. He just has to say that out loud, but he is very, very aware as he was in charge of all of the stuff. When Roswell crashed, they shipped it to the laboratory at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. General McCasland was in charge of that exact laboratory up to a couple of years ago. He not only knows what I'm trying to achieve, he helped assemble my advisory team. He's a very important man. There are also other emails referencing him, but that one should make it pretty clear who Neil McCasland is and what he believed. Other emails read important things as the subject, and it goes, "Hi John, Tom DeLong here, the one who interviewed you for that special documentary not too long ago. Things are moving with the project. The novels, films, and nonfiction works are blooming and finishing. Just had a preliminary meeting with Spielberg's chief operating officer at DreamWorks. More meetings are now in the books. I'd like to bring two very important people out to meet you in DC. I think you will find them very interesting, as they are principal leadership relating to our sensitive topic. Both were in charge of most fragile divisions as relates to classified science and DoD topics. Other words, these are A-level officials, worth our time, and as well the investment to bring them all the way out to you. I just need 2 hours from you. Just looking to have a casual and private conversation in person. Here's some photos from the material I'm using as I met with studio partners. Best, Tom DeLong." We find out that that is a reference to McCasland based on other emails as well. There are possibly other emails buried in there, but from those two we already get a very strong idea of what precisely Neil McCasland believed, and what he also very likely knew. That being a lot about how these craft work, considering he was in charge of the laboratory and the base that housed some of the most infamous crashes of UFOs in history. And so considering these emails were never meant to be read publicly, we can obviously assume that he doesn't want his name out there as a UFO guy and might instead try and obfuscate what precisely he believes in public while pushing out the sort of information he wants to see in public behind the scenes. So instead of 38 years in the military like this account bio says, Neil was in the military for 34, with McCasland serving from 1979 to 2013. His degrees are from USAFA and MIT, not UT and OU. And on top of that, McCasland served in the AFMC. McCasland did participate in the AFMC like this account claims to, which means that this account matches one of the three things that McCasland was in. So obviously there are some differences, but all of those places and access to that information which you would have in those positions would also have made him very knowledgeable on the topics that he claims to be discussing. So Neil is not admitting it's him, but he's giving himself all the credentials that he could be believed for what he's about to get into online. As of now, I'm fairly certain that we have the right direction, but we're not quite there, right? So there is one detail that I think completely solidifies that this is Neil and makes it, in my opinion, very obvious that it's Neil. But first, some context. Since 2022-ish, this account and the owner has posted 1,645 times, which balanced out is something like one a day, but obviously there's a lot of combinations to do when posting. Sometimes he would post once every day, sometimes once every other day, with 5 being the maximum distance that has ever gone between posts on this account in its 4 years of existence. And that's in addition to a solid amount of interaction with those commenting on his posts as well. And it was worth expending oxygen to explain it that way for a very important reason. Because number one, this account that has not gone more than 5 days without posting since it was created 4 years ago has not posted since Neil went missing. Which means that since Neil McCasland went missing on February 27th of 2026, it's been, by the time you guys are seeing this, it's been exactly 1 full month since this account last posted. But it gets even stranger than that. It's not just that this account stopped posting the day Neil went missing. The account made its last post about 30 minutes after Neil was found missing by his wife. Let that sink in. The man whose phone is found on the kitchen table, along with all of his devices, his wallet, and anything and everything needed to trace him for his wife to find him, including the car they drive. This Twitter account makes its last post almost to the exact same minute as all of this happens. And this man disappears without a trace. And so if this account really does belong to Neil, then it should be obvious that it's hiding some very important secrets that we should start looking into. And so now for the real cookie. When you start looking at this Twitter page and you look at it with the notion that it is Neil's, which I do believe it is, then we're going to start seeing some incredibly bizarre things. Like I said, I'm presuming based on all the evidence it's Neil. So instead of saying the account owner, we're just going to say Neil. So Neil was posting information and papers and drawing and guides on how to develop basically exactly what his Twitter page is named after, that being electronic propulsive spacecraft systems. And what's interesting about this account is that as you look into it, it becomes very obvious that whoever is behind it has an intimate knowledge of what they are discussing. And to me on the outside, each post is equally as mystifying as the previous. They're on screen now. We're just going to go through a few of them. When I say that he's referencing textbooks, I mean it. Like here's this B. Brunelli, muon catalyzed fusion and fusion with polarized nuclei. written in copyright 1987. And it's about this book. The International School of Fusion Reactor Technology started its course 15 years ago, and since then has maintained a biennial pace. Generally, each course has developed the subject which was announced in advance at the closing of the previous course. Another example is electroacoustic waves in presence of polarization force. Like, you gotta imagine these are things that are not commonly read. Someone links to another book related, Excess Energy, Utilizing Autogenous Pulsed Abnormal Glow Discharge, which we're gonna see discussed here in a minute, from the 1996 publishing of this book. And so seeing all that lingo and math, I'm very grateful for the final post he made, because it speaks much more to me, as it simply says, generate a small, all caps, local field, followed by breaking the paragraph, and continues with high voltage gap, geometrically placed, allowing sustained dwell time in gap. And so why this makes more sense to me is because of the unique composure of this post compared to the rest. It's very sporadic, it comes kind of out of nowhere, and it sounds more like he's yelling, based on his caps, the answer to something to somebody who was confused. I'll admit, when I read this, I was confused what precisely they're getting at, and if you have experience in engineering, for sure let me know. But it was enough for me to pick up that it's almost like a teacher describing something to a student, like a problem that they just couldn't solve, and so the teacher just spits out the answer at you, or those last bits of information you need to get there on your own. And with that in mind, I actually think that's exactly what's going on here. It's almost like a code of sorts, or part of a building manual. Neil in this case is the teacher. He is giving an answer to somebody, and this entire Twitter feed, when you start looking through it, is a how-to for electric propulsion and energy generation for advanced aircraft systems. And when you start scrolling through it, it feels like a yap session if you're on the outside, but if you're in that classroom, it makes so much more sense. It goes beyond just an energy propulsion system to almost a guidebook on how to do it. It's really easy, like me, to get mystified when you're scrolling through it all with all of this advanced science jargon, and it feels like a yap session from the outside as someone who isn't in this space. But when I applied that mindset to it of the student teacher, it really does make more sense. And so for 4 years, Neil would invariably make sarcastic remarks every once in a while, followed up by a post detailing a paper he read, sometimes from decades ago. And in that, it seems like just a guy ranting about things. But if you start reading the comments, you notice that other people are going along with it. And they're going, oh, that's what I needed, or so this is how this works. And it sounds like you're in a very highly advanced classroom for people who are deeply interested in what is being discussed. And then I want to re-highlight, with that in mind, that Neil will literally give readings in old textbooks and math problems and answers to problems that are supposed to be impossible, or information that is allegedly debunked by mainstream science, and he'll just keep going bar for bar. Even assigning textbook readings from the previous millennia, one of which was from 1968, which was about some advanced and obscure math concept that most people haven't even probably ever thought of in this world. And other times he'll link to an obscure video someone made discussing this very topic. And like I said, this is beyond my wheelhouse, but it is nonetheless beautiful. When you start scrolling through it, if you have the know-how, and if you do, I recommend looking through this. But what stands out beyond just the quotes and the video links and the old textbooks and the math is that buried within this magnificent timeline of Neil's are a host of hand-done drawings by the man himself. And Neil, a man covering up his identity, and likely rightfully so based on what happened to him, he phrases the things in these drawings as experiences he had while on board a plane, likely because he was an engineer, which does make sense because Neil, in his bio, has over 3,300 logged flight hours on a variety of aircraft, which makes sense because he's an Air Force general. But in the past, however, he has said the following about these drawings. For instance, quote, I saw this in 1998 from the cockpit of a KC-135. And on screen, we're seeing this drawing of a trail that almost looks like a rainbow emanating from a strange orb. And on it, we have a bunch of handwritten notes referencing that it's not to scale, that there's dissipative trailing, and then guesses at what the gases are made of based on the different colors. All these notes detailing what he saw in incredible detail, considering he only got to see it once and not for a very long time. Furthermore, if we look closer at the picture, we're going to notice in the bottom left that it says, the dot at the front was incandescent white with a halo of Crookes dark space. I initially saw it going east to west along the Kansas border. Approximate initial altitude FL 1500, stepping down to FL 900 in a series of quick 90-degree downsteps. The tail was a beautiful multicolored fluorescent, collapsing ionized gas zone over 100 miles long. I've seen the bright royal green and ionized helium experiments before. Now there's a lot on here that we could get into, but I think that last sentence is very clear, and that it hints even more that this is Neil, and this is a very real experience he had, because Neil has done a lot of laboratory work in his career, and he's referencing a time in the lab where he had seen this sort of experiment conducted to create light like this. So I wonder if it's true he just saw it while flying, or if he saw this sort of thing demonstrated in a laboratory, or if it's perhaps both. But in any case, it is obvious that Neil saw something beyond current conceptions of how aircraft work. Whether or not that's an alien, I don't know, or it's advanced government tech that has been hidden under this idea of aliens, who knows? But either way, Neil is clearly saying something awesome. When you look at the back of this piece of paper, you can see that there are more notes in the background. And so I decided to take the photo, put it into Photoshop, and bump the contrast and the brightness, and so we can see more of the text behind it. And as that becomes more readable, it gives us more clues as to what we are presuming Neil saw. And behind the image, it appears to not just be the drawing of the distance shot of this thing. It almost looks like the schematics for how to possibly build or rebuild whatever this viewer saw just that once in 1998. That, however, is not the only hand-drawn image. Over the course of the years, several others have popped up on his timeline, each possibly more mysterious than the last, and I'll show them quickly on screen and let you analyze them without my yap. Bizarre maybe, but the amount of science discussed in literature and citations provided and clear confidence with the language are just mind-blowing. It suggests someone with an intimate, dare I say, lifelong career dealing with this sort of aircraft and advanced propulsion systems and technology. It is truly something to behold. It is a master at work. And assuming this is Neil, which all signs point to, then it's obvious that he was knee-deep in things far beyond what had been described and what the military claims to have access to. And his disappearance that morning, like Monica Reza and Melissa Casillas, becomes even stranger, as they perhaps all knew a bit too much in their own regard about the aspects of these deep covert secret programs and plans around them. And to that end, I think Neil's wife has some answers about what that may be. Susan, that being Neil's wife, has made a few posts on the topic of her husband's disappearance, but literally only a few. 3 seems to be the max from what I could tell on Facebook, with the last one being from March 7th, which seems really low to me, but I'll digress on that point. She doesn't seem too pressed to find him, and even makes jokes about what might have happened to him. And in one long post she made giving updates on the search, I'm going to read that segment, 1 for the weird humor, and 2 for something wild. Susan McCasland Wilkerson. After the Russians hacked John Podesta's emails, see Neil's Wikipedia page, there was less contact with Tom and the community pushing for a release of UFO information. This connection is not a reason for someone to abduct Neil. Neil does not have any special knowledge about the ET bodies and debris from the Roswell crash stored at Wright Pat, though at this point, with absolutely no sign of him, maybe the best hypothesis is that aliens beamed him up to the mothership. However, no sightings of a mothership hovering above the Sandia Mountains have been reported. Yeah, what? First of all, let's just, what? Why are we joking about your husband being abducted by aliens after he literally disappeared into thin air and was involved in UFO research? Whatever you think aliens are, this probably isn't the time to make that joke, but I want to reiterate at what Neil's wife said. It's that part just before the last bit that stands out more than that really weird joke, that being where she says, this connection is not a reason for someone to abduct Neil. Neil does not have any special knowledge about the ET bodies and debris from the Roswell crash stored at Wright Pat. I'm sorry, what? That's not a allegedly or supposedly stored there or rumored to be held there. That is it is stored there. So are you kidding me? One, then he would obviously have special knowledge because he had access and controlled that base. So any information he has there is valuable. But more importantly than that, she herself, Susan, would also be in a place to know of this sort of covert material. And not just because she's Neil's wife, but also because she too holds a PhD in astrophysics, was a NASA astronaut semi-finalist, has a TS and SCI clearance, which is really high up there towards the top, and has all sorts of experience in these exact same industries as Neil, and even was a consultant with Neil in a business they started for the Department of Defense consulting, contracting, military stuff. And so I do have to wonder what Susan knows, considering she was not only involved in all the things we mentioned, but eventually became a colonel in the Air Force, which would have granted her access to top secret and covert information, especially with her science background. And so when she's making these weird jokes about aliens and confirming that there are bodies and wreckage from UFOs at Roswell, I don't even know what to think there. If this is some deflection and she's trying to throw us off the scent, or if she's really saying that and maybe wants us to follow that trail, I don't know. But to try and deny that he has UFO knowledge and then prove that he does is a really weird take to have. But my gut makes me feel that Susan is not on our side of this, as she is the backstop preventing much information getting out. She hasn't revealed much about her husband. She could easily be telling us more, but isn't. And she just doesn't seem to be giving out much at all, even in terms of updates, with only 3 Facebook posts on this whole matter. And so that is where I'm going to call it for now. But if I were a suspicious man, which I certainly am, the list does only grow. We could point out Nuno Loreno, who was blasted on his front doorstep in Boston, just like Carl Grillmer. And also within a few days of Carl, as Nuno lost his life on December the 16th of 2025, which is around the same time that guy showed up to Carl's house the first time. And so that's another brilliant mind snuffed out mercilessly, connected to this web of increasingly dark connections in government work. And so until next time, you guys, stay curious, don't fall for the lies, no matter how convincing they are, and I can't wait to see each and every one of you in the next one.